Germany did not suddenly fall into war, it prepared for it step by step. While the world still believed in peace, one nation was building factories, training masses of youth, absorbing territories without firing a shot and signing impossible pacts. By 1939, nothing more needed to be built. The economy revolved around war, society thought like an army, and the Wehrmacht awaited only a single order. On September 1st, the machine was set in motion. A defeat that fueled resentment. In November 1918, Germany collapsed from within, exhausted by the economic blockade, with its army still on enemy soil but unable to resist. The generals agreed to request an armistice. The Kaiser abdicated, and the new civilian government signed the capitulation. Most soldiers returned without having been defeated in a decisive confrontation, which fueled the idea that someone far from the front had betrayed the fatherland. The defeat was not accepted as a military fact, but as a moral humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, turned that perception into an official condemnation. Germany was declared solely responsible for the war, was forced to pay reparations estimated at 132 billion gold marks, and lost 13% of its European territory and 10% of its population. Alsace and Lorraine were handed over to France, Posen and parts of Silesia passed to Poland, and the Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of the Reich. The Saar region was placed under international administration, and the Rhineland was demilitarized. The German army was reduced to 100,000 professional men without compulsory service, without tanks, without aviation, without heavy artillery, and with a minimal navy. The elimination of the general staff was ordered to prevent any future strategic capability. The Reichswehr, limited by the treaty, was conceived as a symbolic defensive force. But its leaders, led by General Hans von Seeckt, interpreted the reduction as an opportunity to create a highly disciplined elite corps capable of rapid expansion if conditions changed. Officers were selected under strict criteria, and regulations were designed to form command cadres rather than massive forces. In parallel, clandestine ties were maintained with the Soviet Union through the 1922 Rapallo Agreement, which allowed secret training of pilots, tank crews, and chemical units on Russian territory, outside international surveillance. Meanwhile, the economic war continued. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed the savings of millions of citizens. The mark, which in 1919 was valued at 48 per dollar, reached 4.2 trillion per dollar in November 1923. Wages were paid twice a day so that food could be bought before prices rose. Poverty and chaos generated a widespread feeling of national collapse. The French-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr in January 1923, motivated by defaults on payments, provoked passive resistance that paralyzed industry. National pride was struck not on the battlefields, but in the streets and factories under the supervision of foreign soldiers. The young Weimar Republic, born amid defeat, was perceived as a structure imposed by the victors. The left was accused of having sabotaged the war effort. Jews and socialists were pointed to as supposed internal conspirators. This narrative, known as the stab-in-the-back myth, was spread by nationalists, demobilized officers, and paramilitary movements. The formations of ex-combatants, such as the Freikorps, became private forces that crushed communist uprisings, repressed insurgencies, and generated an atmosphere of constant violence. Within them, a generation of young men was trained who did not accept defeat as definitive and who believed in the need for a future military revenge. The attempts at economic stabilization through the 1924 Dawes Plan and the adoption of the Rentenmark managed to temporarily restore financial confidence. However, millions had come to understand that a collapse could happen again. Reparations continued to weigh as an unbearable burden, and the perception that Germany was being slowly strangled remained intact. The treaty was not seen as an endpoint, but as a deferred declaration of war. The army, though reduced, continued to be one of the few pillars of national stability. Its prestige survived the defeat. Unlike the democratic institutions, which seemed weak and compromising, the military tradition preserved an image of honor and discipline. The oath remained to the Reich, not to the Republic. Many officers resented the new political system, which they considered responsible for having accepted surrender. On the social front, a generation of men who had fought returned to a nation that had no place for them. Unemployment and mass demobilization fueled frustration. Many saw the war not as a mistake, but as an experience of camaraderie and collective purpose that they longed to recover. Pacifism did not take deep root. The defeat was assumed as a historical injustice that one day had to be corrected. The Great Depression of 1929 destroyed the fragile balance. Unemployment rose from less than 2 million to more than 6 million in 3 years. The German economy, dependent on foreign credit, collapsed. Distrust toward democratic politics turned into outright rejection. In this scenario, speeches promising to restore military strength and avenge the humiliation of 1919 gained renewed force. Collective memory was not fixed on the horrors of war, but on lost pride. The defeat did not produce an anti-militarist conviction, but a latent resentment. The army, though reduced to a shadow, was still perceived as the spiritual heart of the nation. Many were willing to rebuild it if decisive leadership emerged. The condition imposed by Versailles, far from guaranteeing European security, created a Germany convinced that only through strength could it regain its dignity. Demilitarization did not eliminate the warlike ambition, it displaced it toward an as yet undefined future. Beneath the appearance of a pacified republic, the desire to reorganize the country as a great fortress survived. The ground was prepared for a project that would unite national revenge, disciplinary reorganization, and military reconstruction. Only someone to lead it was missing. Weimar and the army in the shadows. The Weimar Republic was born with a foundational contradiction. It proclaimed democracy while depending on an armed force that never believed in it. The Reichswehr, limited to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, did not disappear as the Allies intended. It transformed into a hermetic elite institution, designed not for the present but for a future in which Germany could fight again. Under the direction of General Hans von Seeckt between 1920 and 1926, the army was reorganized as a reduced but select body composed only of professional soldiers, with officers carefully chosen to preserve the Prussian military tradition. Its objectives were not defensive, they were to be the nucleus from which a massive army would be reborn when circumstances allowed. The prohibition on possessing tanks, aviation, and heavy artillery did not halt technical preparation. The Reichswehr simulated motorized units with civilian vehicles and carried out theoretical exercises that anticipated future mobile operations. Part of the training was clandestinely moved abroad. Through the Treaty of Versailles, signed with the Soviet Union in 1922, Germany obtained access to land and military facilities for weapons testing and training of pilots, tank crews, and chemical units. In Kazan, covert tank schools were formed. In Lipetsk, aviators were trained who in later years would form the nucleus of the Luftwaffe. Everything was carried out under industrial or agricultural cover to avoid the surveillance of the Allied commissions. Internally, Seeckt promoted a strict doctrine. The Reichswehr had to be a small force, but capable of rapid expansion. Officers were educated as future commanders of large, non-existent units. Flexibility, tactical initiative, and decentralized command were emphasized, anticipating concepts that would later define Blitzkrieg. Although Versailles had dissolved the general staff, its functions continued under technical organizations with other names. Strategic archives were maintained, the campaigns of 1914 to 1918 were analyzed, and mistakes were reviewed to plan a new way of waging war. The army's loyalty to the Republic was conditional and ambiguous. The soldier's oath was not directed to the democratic constitution, but to the Reich as an abstract entity, which allowed their commitment to be interpreted more with the nation than with the current political system. In 1920, the failed Kapp-Lüttwitz coup revealed this structural distrust. When the Reichswehr was asked to suppress the coup plotters, the commanding general argued that soldiers do not shoot at soldiers. That passivity showed that the army still conceived of itself as the true guardian of national order, closer to the old conservative elite than to civilian politicians. The message was clear. The army would obey as long as the Republic did not interfere in its internal evolution. Outside the official framework, thousands of demobilized veterans filled the ranks of paramilitary organizations. The Freikorps acted as auxiliary forces in suppressing communist uprisings in 1919 and 1920, and many of their members retained training and arms in illegal circuits. Later, organizations such as Der Stahlhelm emerged, with an openly nationalist and militarist ideology functioning as reservoirs of unofficial military potential. These groups not only kept the culture of violence alive, but supplied a human reserve willing to rejoin an expanded army when the time came. Military schools, although disguised as technical institutions, continued to transmit the Prussian military tradition. Training emphasized values of obedience, sacrifice, and discipline, reinforcing an identity separate from the rest of civil society. The Reichswehr considered itself the custodian of the true essence of the Reich, in contrast with political parties, which it saw as fragmented and weak. Officers did not openly participate in politics, but cultivated connections with conservative circles that longed for new authoritarian leadership. Psychological rearmament was as important as the technical one. Defeat was not assumed as a failure of the military institution, but as the result of political and social factors considered alien to the honor of the army. The narrative of the stab in the back continued to be shared in the barracks. The enemy had not been stronger, but Germany had been sabotaged by treacherous internal elements. This conviction allowed the future return to arms to be justified not as an aggressive act, but as an act of national redemption. During the relatively stable years from 1924 to 1929, while the economy recovered thanks to foreign credit, the army continued operating silently. Although it could not display force, it trained intensively in small-scale tactical exercises aimed at perfecting flexible maneuvers. Discipline remained ironclad, and the selection of commanders was made with ideological criteria that were non-partisan but deeply nationalist. Defenders of Weimar were not sought, but guardians of a future rebirth. With the crisis of 1929, confidence in the Republic collapsed and authoritarian and militarist ideas regained prestige. Many officers began to see in movements such as the Nazi Party a possible tool to restore German power, although without initially sharing its radicalism. The army was not yet subject to Hitler, but it already considered likely that change would come from the hands of strong leadership willing to break the chains of Versailles. At the end of the 1920s, Germany did not yet possess a large armed force, but it did have a potential structure ready to expand rapidly. There was doctrine, command cadres, clandestine links, accumulated paramilitary experience, and a sense of historical mission waiting to be activated. The Republic had been tolerated as a tactical pause, not as an endpoint. Every covert maneuver, every officer trained in secret, every clandestine alliance with the Soviets, every veteran eager for action was part of a continuous process. The country had externally accepted the conditions imposed by its victors, while internally it kept alive the purpose of once again becoming a military power. The path toward rearmament no longer depended on immediate material resources, but on a collective will for revenge. The army had not been destroyed, it had mutated. Weimar did not create a peaceful society. It generated an incubation period in which the military structure adapted to clandestinity and patiently prepared to be reborn. Defeat had been only an interruption. Next time, Germany would attempt not only to recover what was lost, but to build a war apparatus that could not be dismantled again. The internal enemy as a military pretext. The defeat of 1918 was not followed by a collective acceptance of failure, but by an obsessive search for culprits. In that emotional void, the idea arose that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but destroyed from within by elements considered alien to the true nation. The Socialist Revolution of November, the brief government of the Spartacists in Berlin, and the assassination of figures such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht fed the fear of a communist takeover similar to the Bolshevik one in Russia. That fear consolidated one perception. The greatest danger to Germany's future was not foreign powers, but enemies infiltrated within its own borders. The rise of the German Communist Party, KPD, in 1919 reinforced the feeling of internal threat. The workers' insurrections of 1919 to 1921, the clashes in the Ruhr Basin, and the attempts at revolutionary general strikes were perceived as permanent efforts to destroy the national order. Conservative and military sectors identified communism as a form of latent civil war, which justified for them the existence of paramilitary forces such as the Freikorps, charged with crushing uprisings without legal restraint. Each failed uprising did not eliminate fear, but made it more functional to the construction of a constant enemy. Anti-communism thus became an indispensable tool to legitimize military action within a state that officially lived in peace. But a political enemy was not enough. it was necessary to attribute that threat to identifiable social groups. Jews were presented as international conspirators associated both with speculative capitalism and with revolutionary Bolshevism. This contradiction did not matter, because the goal was not rational analysis but the creation of a category of permanent suspects. The idea of a Judeo-Bolshevik plot was spread, and figures such as the banker, the journalist, and the revolutionary agitator were presented as interchangeable faces of the same infiltrated enemy. This logic made it possible to link all national problems to internal agents considered unpatriotic: Jews, communists, social democrats, pacifists, liberal intellectuals. It was not merely a matter of identifying political opponents, but of turning them into pathological elements that weakened the national fortress and hindered future rearmament. Under this vision, any project of military reconstruction had to begin with an internal ideological cleansing that would make possible the forging of a homogeneous national community willing to accept wartime sacrifice. The army observed this process closely. During the Weimar years, the Reichswehr maintained an officially neutral position but saw the communists as a direct threat to its existence. In 1923, during the communist uprising in Hamburg, army officers collaborated with the Freikorps in repressive operations. It began to be assumed that a future civil war was a probable scenario and that Germany had to prepare for it before once again facing external enemies. Thus, preparation for international war was directly linked to the need to eliminate any internal resistance. The nationalist press spread the idea that the Republic was a space infiltrated by enemy agents. Left-wing parties were accused of favoring foreign interests and Jews of undermining national morale. A psychological climate was created in which social mistrust became a patriotic value. National cohesion was built not around a common project, but on the identification and exclusion of those considered traitors. This discourse found resonance among thousands of unemployed and disillusioned veterans. For many ex-soldiers, the blame for defeat did not fall on the army but on civilians who had supposedly undermined resistance from the rear. The internal enemy was not an ideological abstraction. It was presented as a real figure who had cost lives and prevented victory. That narrative justified the need for future extreme measures because the enemy had already shown that it could destroy the country without a single foreign shot. Political organizations took advantage of this emotional framework to militarize their activities. The Nazi Party, still a minority during the 1920s, created its paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung, SA, with ex-combatants who saw street violence as a continuation of the war. The SA did not present itself as a traditional political force, but as a people's army destined to defend Germany against internal enemies. Their uniformed marches and confrontations with communist militants were not only acts of intimidation, they were symbolic rehearsals for a future national reconquest through force. The constant clashes between communist and nationalist militants turned the streets into a stage of permanent conflict. Industrial cities were treated as disputed territories. Politics began to be understood not as debate but as combat. This perception favored the acceptance of militarized solutions as the only way to restore order. Under this logic, national strength did not depend on democracy but on the elimination of the internal enemy and the creation of a disciplined and homogeneous social body. Anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and contempt for parliamentarianism thus converged on the same objective: to justify the idea that Germany could not rise again as a power unless it first destroyed the elements considered degenerate. The future war would not only be external, it would begin within the country itself, against hidden enemies. Material rearmament had to be accompanied by ideological rearmament. The nation had to be unified under a single identity to function as an army in potential. By the late 1920s, the notion of the internal enemy was already established as an emotional truth for large social sectors. The economic crisis of 1929 intensified that feeling. Millions of impoverished Germans sought culprits and found in nationalist speeches a clear and violent explanation. The enemy was not the global crisis, but the supposed internal saboteurs. The solution ceased to be economic or political. It became a task of national purification. Under this climate, political violence stopped being seen as a threat and began to be perceived as a necessary mechanism for national restoration. The state, unable to control the chaos, was exposed to being replaced by a force that promised to eradicate the enemy at its root. The more this logic consolidated, the more Germany was psychologically prepared to accept total militarization. War came to be understood as an act of rescue, not of aggression. The internal enemy had been successfully installed. The nation was ready to listen to whoever promised to destroy it definitively and turn that act into the starting point of new greatness. The ideological ground for the future military machine was already completely sown. Only the one who would give the order was missing. Hitler, from agitator to supreme commander in potential. Adolf Hitler did not emerge as a military strategist, but as a political agitator who knew how to interpret a latent need. Germany was looking for a leader capable of channeling national resentment into a project of power. In 1919, when he joined the German Workers' Party, DAP, that movement was an insignificant group of nationalists without solid political structure. Hitler, a former corporal of the Bavarian army, quickly assumed a central role as an orator. His speeches mixed anti-communism, anti-Semitism, and the demand for military revenge, shaping an emotional program that connected with disillusioned veterans, impoverished workers, and bourgeois frightened by the collapse of social order. In February 1920, the DAP was transformed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. Hitler not only radicalized his discourse but systematized it as a national project. His goal was not to compete within parliamentary politics, but to replace it with a unified system under personal leadership. During these years, he developed the idea of the Führerprinzip, the principle of absolute leadership. The leader does not represent the people, he embodies them. In his vision, a state divided among parties was weak and incapable of preparing for a new war. Therefore, the concentration of power in a single figure was a military necessity more than a personal ambition. The first attempt to turn his movement into direct action occurred with the failed Munich Putsch of November 8th and 9th, 1923. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler attempted to overthrow the government of Bavaria and march on Berlin. The uprising failed and Hitler was arrested. However, the trial allowed him to present himself as a patriot who sought to free Germany from the yoke of Versailles. His sentence of 5 years in prison, of which he served barely 9 months, functioned as a platform to expand his national image. In prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, where he outlined his strategic vision. Germany had to recover its military power, destroy Marxism, eliminate Jewish influence, and expand eastward in search of living space, Lebensraum. War was considered inevitable and necessary, not as defense, but as an act of conquest. Mein Kampf was not just an ideological manifesto, but a scheme of future foreign policy. Hitler conceived himself as the commander of a national crusade, not as a simple party leader. Upon leaving prison in 1924, the NSDAP adopted a new strategy: abandon direct coups and grow from within the system, without renouncing violence as an auxiliary tool. The party was hierarchically structured as an army in potential. The SA expanded as a shock force and recruited ex-soldiers and unemployed youth who saw in political violence a way to recover identity and belonging. The mass rallies became demonstrations of collective discipline. The uniformed marches not only intimidated rivals, they symbolized an embryonic army ready to act. Hitler understood that to obtain real power, he had to win the trust of conservative sectors and, above all, of the army. The Reichswehr viewed the disorder of the SA with suspicion, but observed with interest the revisionist message of the party. Hitler began to present himself as the only one capable of unifying the nation under strong leadership to break the chains of Versailles. In his meetings with military figures, he insisted that the army would be the nucleus of the future strong state he projected. He committed to restoring its greatness and expanding its resources in exchange for its loyalty when the time came. The economic crisis of 1929 transformed the perception of the NSDAP. In the 1930 elections, it went from 12 to 107 seats in the Reichstag. Hitler ceased to be a marginal agitator and became a national alternative. His speeches focused on the promise of a disciplined, unified, and militarily powerful Germany. Unlike other parties, he did not offer parliamentary compromises, but a historical mission to destroy internal enemies and prepare the country for a new international confrontation. He presented himself as the Führer who would lead Germany toward its warlike rebirth. The internal structure of the party began to function as an ideological army. Obedience to the leader was absolute. Hierarchies were established from top to bottom with direct transmission of orders. The party was trained for instant mobilization, as if preparing for a permanent state of national emergency. Hitler did not need to demonstrate formal military training. His authority was based on the belief that he possessed a historical mission similar to that of a supremely designated commander. His institutional access to power began in January 1933, when he was appointed Chancellor after agreements with conservative sectors who believed they could control him. The reality was different. In less than 6 months, he destroyed his allies and took total control of the state. His vision of total leadership translated into the decisive step toward the construction of an apparatus with war capability. Hitler did not assume the role of administrator. He acted as a chief preparing to lead a nation in combat. Every speech was formulated in terms of struggle, destiny, defeat, or triumph. Every enemy was defined as an obstacle to the expansion of national power. Although a war economy had not yet been formally established, Hitler began to reorganize the state as if it were in a phase prior to conflict. He eliminated political dissent, subordinated justice, initiated absolute control of the media, and turned the party into the ideological arm of the government. He prepared society to obey following the model of military command. The leader decides, the people execute. He appealed not so much to reason as to the will for total surrender. The cult of the Führer gradually replaced institutional loyalty and positioned the future war as collective destiny. Hitler reached the summit not as a parliamentary politician, but as a potential commander of a marching Reich. He had turned national resentment into program, humiliation into ideological fuel, and frustration into mobilizing energy. One-person leadership was conceived as an indispensable condition to wage total war. In the eyes of many Germans, the man who promised to destroy internal enemies would also be capable of confronting foreign ones. The transformation from agitator to supreme commander began before taking power. It would be completed when he turned the state and the entire society into instruments of a new army. The state turned into a barrack seizure of power in 1933 to 1934. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the Reich by President Paul von Hindenburg. For broad conservative and military sectors, it was seen as a controlled bet. They believed they could use the Nazi leader to stabilize the country, neutralize communism, and restore authority. They did not understand that Hitler did not intend to share power, but to absorb it. From the first day, his behavior was not that of a parliamentary head of government, but of a commander preparing an internal occupation. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag fire provided the ideal pretext to eliminate legal opposition. Although responsibility for the act was never clearly proven, Hitler presented it as proof of a communist conspiracy to destroy Germany from within. The next day, the president signed the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended freedom of the press, assembly, and domicile, allowing arrests without judicial order. More than 10,000 people, mainly communists and socialists, were arrested within weeks. The fear of an internal revolution justified the establishment of a permanent state of emergency. On March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act granted Hitler's government the power to pass laws without parliamentary intervention. With that instrument, the democratic system was legally neutralized. The Reichstag remained as a ceremonial body. Legislative power had been absorbed by the executive. The transformation of the state began through the process known as Gleichschaltung, coordination, which consisted of aligning all political, administrative, and social institutions with Nazi ideology. In May 1933, the trade unions were dissolved and replaced by the German Labour Front under state control. Political parties were dissolved or banned between June and July of that year, until on July 14th a law was promulgated declaring the NSDAP the only legal party. German federalism was destroyed when regional governments, Länder, were subordinated directly to the Reich through the appointment of Nazi governors. The public administration was purged of opponents, and an oath of loyalty to the new regime was required. The method was not to create new institutions, but to empty existing ones of their old content and put them at the service of a centralized apparatus of power. While civil functions were being centralized, Hitler began to structure a dual system of repressive force: a formal state police and an ideological arm linked to the party. The Gestapo, originally created in Prussia, quickly evolved into a national secret police with unlimited authority to arrest and detain without trial. In parallel, the SS under Heinrich Himmler emerged as an elite corps dedicated to the protection of the regime. These forces did not replace the regular army but began to form a parallel structure loyal exclusively to the Führer. The Nazi power apparatus immediately addressed the problem of the SA. The Sturmabteilungen, with more than 2 million members in 1934 under the command of Ernst Röhm, were conceived as a revolutionary force that aspired to become the new People's Army of Germany. Röhm demanded that the Reichswehr be absorbed or subordinated to the SA, which alarmed the traditional military leadership. For Hitler, Röhm's ambition represented an existential threat. He needed the army's support for rearmament and could not afford a conflict with those who still legally controlled the country's military power. The tension culminated in the Night of the Long Knives between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934. By Hitler's direct order, the SA leadership was arrested and summarily executed. Ernst Röhm was murdered. Dozens of leaders, former political rivals and conservative figures considered dangerous, were also eliminated. The purge presented violence as an act of national security. By destroying the SA's autonomous power and reaffirming the monopoly of force under the Führer's direction, Hitler obtained the explicit support of the Reichswehr. On August 2, 1934, Hindenburg died. That same day, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, proclaiming himself Führer und Reichskanzler. The army was forced to swear loyalty not to the constitution nor to the German state, but personally to Hitler. This oath transformed the relationship between the army and political power. The Wehrmacht became the instrument of an absolute leader and not an independent guardian of the nation. By securing direct military loyalty, Hitler turned the state into a vertical chain of command ready for future operations. In less than 2 years, Germany had been reorganized as a political barrack. Civil institutions functioned as administrative departments of centralized power. It was not yet a formal wartime state, but the logic was already that of constant preparation. The elimination of internal opposition was not an act of public order, but the first step to ensure that any rearmament and military expansion plan could be carried out without political or social resistance. The process of Gleichschaltung not only subordinated all organizations to the state, but disciplined society to obey orders as if it were in military formation. The unity of the people began to be presented in terms of mobilization, not participation. The Führer was the sole point of reference. The concept of the people was redefined as a community subordinated to a superior command. By mid-1934, Germany no longer functioned as a republic in reconstruction, but as a unified organism under a leader who had transformed political power into a rigid pyramidal structure. Justice was aligned to apply a notion of the health of the state, which allowed condemning any action contrary to the will of the regime. The law enforcement forces were no longer designed to maintain civil coexistence, but to eliminate threats to a national project oriented toward confrontation. The German state became a machine of ideological and organizational centralization. Total obedience had been secured not by consent, but by systematic restructuring of institutional life. Hitler had gained not only power, he had ensured that his power could be used without interference to transform Germany into more than a country, into a force ready to march. The next step would not be political, it would be military. The birth of the Führer's new army. When Hitler consolidated his political power in 1934, the German army still formally existed as a limited and disciplined force, but still tied to the restrictions of Versailles. The Reichswehr was made up of barely 100,000 men, without compulsory military service and without modern weapons. Its structure, designed by Seizure as the nucleus for a future massive army, was ready to expand. Hitler understood that this potential had to be activated and personally subordinated to his authority. The purge of the SA in the Night of the Long Knives had secured the support of the High Military Command, which allowed progress without institutional resistance. On March 16, 1935, Hitler decreed the reinstatement of compulsory military service and publicly announced the creation of the new Wehrmacht, replacing the Reichswehr. The limitation of 100,000 men was abolished without immediate consequences from the Western powers. By the end of that year, the army reached approximately 550,000 personnel, organized into multiple divisions. In a short time, thousands of retired officers were summoned and new cadres were rapidly trained. The military oath, which in 1934 had been transformed to bind each soldier directly to Hitler, reinforced personal and not institutional loyalty. The new armed force not only regained size but changed doctrine. Under the impulse of officers such as Heinz Guderian, the creation of panzer divisions began, formed by armored units combined with motorized infantry, mobile artillery and air support. This model, inspired by analyses of the weaknesses of trench warfare and the potential of mechanized mobility, sought to break enemy lines with speed and coordination. The German army did not intend to fight the previous war again. It planned to avoid it through speed and shock. At the same time, on March 1, 1935, Hitler officially proclaimed the existence of the Luftwaffe, headed by Hermann Göring. In reality, the Air Force had begun to form clandestinely since 1933, with pilots trained in schools disguised as flying clubs. By 1936, Germany already had squadrons equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. The Luftwaffe was conceived not as passive support for the army, but as a key offensive weapon in modern war. Its role would be to destroy defenses, paralyze enemy logistics, and sow psychological terror. The Kriegsmarine, although limited by industrial delay and previous prohibitions, also began its expansion. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935 allowed Germany to rebuild its navy up to 35% of British tonnage. The construction of modern submarines resumed and a surface fleet was planned which, although still incipient, aimed to challenge maritime routes. The professionalization of the new army was accompanied by a doctrinal purge. Commanders who distrusted the regime were removed or retired. Young officers loyal to the Führer rose quickly. Obedience to Hitler became a structural command principle. Strategy was no longer designed only in the barracks, but according to the personal will of the leader. The Wehrmacht became the armed arm of a political project already conceived as preparation for an inevitable conflict. Military training intensified at all levels. The first great mobilization exercises were carried out, along with public displays of power and massive parades that displayed not only discipline but mechanical force. German society was constantly exposed to images of the new army as a symbol of national resurrection. The panzer divisions and Luftwaffe squadrons were presented as emblems of the future. Military pride, deeply rooted since the imperial era, resurfaced with renewed intensity. However, the new army was not free from internal tensions. While the Wehrmacht strengthened itself as the formal force of the state, the SS began to develop its own military arm, the SS Verfügungstruppe, destined to become ideologized combat units. Although initially small, these formations were directly subordinated to Heinrich Himmler and responded exclusively to Hitler. Their existence generated concern among traditional command, but the Führer balanced these bodies to maintain control over armed power and avoid absolute dependence on a single estate. Between 1936 and 1938, rearmament was not only a material matter, but an organizational one. The doctrine of offensive war took concrete form. Cooperation between land and air forces was intensified in joint exercises, with emphasis on speed, surprise, and coordination. What would later be known as Blitzkrieg was not yet a formalized doctrine, but was emerging as the logical result of new technical capabilities. The central idea was to avoid prolonged war of attrition through decisive and rapid blows that left the enemy without capacity to respond. His institutional access to power began in January 1933, when he was appointed Chancellor after agreements with conservative sectors who believed they could control him. The reality was different. In less than 6 months, he destroyed his allies and took total control of the state. His vision of total leadership translated into the decisive step toward the construction of an apparatus with war capability. Hitler did not assume the role of administrator. He acted as a chief preparing to lead a nation in combat. Every speech was formulated in terms of struggle, destiny, defeat, or triumph. Every enemy was defined as an obstacle to the expansion of national power. Although a war economy had not yet been formally established, Hitler began to reorganize the state as if it were in a phase prior to conflict. He eliminated political dissent, subordinated justice, initiated absolute control of the media, and turned the party into the ideological arm of the government. He prepared society to obey following the model of military command. The leader decides, the people execute. He appealed not so much to reason as to the will for total surrender. The cult of the Führer gradually replaced institutional loyalty and positioned the future war as collective destiny. Hitler reached the summit not as a parliamentary politician, but as a potential commander of a marching Reich. He had turned national resentment into program, humiliation into ideological fuel, and frustration into mobilizing energy. One-person leadership was conceived as an indispensable condition to wage total war. In the eyes of many Germans, the man who promised to destroy internal enemies would also be capable of confronting foreign ones. The transformation from agitator to supreme commander began before taking power. It would be completed when he turned the state and the entire society into instruments of a new army. The war economy before the war. Starting in 1934, Germany began to transform its economy as if it were already waging a conflict, even though there was no open military mobilization yet. The objective was not financial stability, but preparation for a future war. Hitler conceived the economy as an instrument subordinated to the expansion of national power. Rearmament was not to be a response to external threats, but the engine guiding all national production. To achieve this goal, it was necessary to reduce external dependence, increase heavy industry, and ensure that war production capacity would surpass any enemy reaction before it could materialize. In absolute secrecy, military budgets began to grow from 1933 onward. In 1932, they represented about 1% of GDP. By 1935, they had reached 9% and would continue to rise. Financing relied on instruments such as MIFO bills, designed to conceal real military expenditure and avoid immediate fiscal collapse. They were issued as industrial debts and backed by the state, allowing factories to receive payment for armaments without those funds appearing in official budgets. This mechanism generated artificial liquidity at the cost of future debt, under the assumption that victory in war would allow repayment through the plundering of conquered territories. On October 18, 1936, Hitler appointed Hermann Göring director of the four-year plan, whose mission was to prepare Germany for war within a maximum of 4 years. The priority was to achieve self-sufficiency in essential raw materials: steel, coal, oil, rubber, and aluminum. The official directive was clear. The army must be ready for action in 4 years. The economy must be ready for war in 4 years. Under this mandate, exploitation of domestic deposits accelerated and production of synthetic materials was promoted. Companies such as IG Farben developed artificial rubber, Buna, and synthetic fuels derived from coal. Krupp expanded its production capacity for armor and artillery. Siemens and other companies joined the system as essential suppliers for military communications, engines, and electrical systems. The creation of Reichswerke Hermann Göring, a massive state steel conglomerate, allowed an increase in steel production without depending on companies that might resist state directives. This enterprise absorbed mines, steelworks, and industrial plants to direct them exclusively toward military production. Private enterprise was subordinated to central planning, although companies formally remained private property. Decisions about resource allocation, production, and prices came to be determined by Reich authorities. Employment, severely affected after the 1929 crisis, was redirected toward rearmament. The construction of roads, highways, Reichsautobahnen, factories, and defensive fortresses served to absorb unemployed labor and legitimize the economic program before the population. Propaganda presented the reduction of unemployment as proof of the regime's success, without mentioning that it was linked to a military preparation effort. By 1938, official unemployment was practically non-existent, but a large portion of the active population was directly or indirectly integrated into sectors linked to the war apparatus. Civil consumption did not expand proportionally. Prices and wages were controlled, strategic products were rationed, and a culture of collective sacrifice was promoted. The population was prepared to accept restrictions with the promise of a future of abundance that would come only after victory. The idea that Germany was a nation surrounded by enemies justified postponing immediate well-being in favor of rearmament. The economy was presented as a battlefield where each worker had a role equivalent to that of a soldier. The strategy of autarky had limits. Germany lacked essential resources such as oil, natural rubber, manganese, and certain strategic minerals. Territorial expansion became a material condition of economic survival. The concept of Lebensraum ceased to be an abstract ideological idea and became a logistical objective: to conquer territory, to obtain raw materials and secure future supply lines. The conquest of the East was conceived not only in racial terms, but as a structural solution to the Reich's resource deficit. War was no longer a future possibility, it was a planned economic necessity. Rearmament generated a growing demand for soldiers, engineers, technicians, and specialized labor. Technical schools were expanded, and training programs oriented toward military needs were established. From 1937 onward, the possibility of resorting in the future to foreign forced labor in the event of a prolonged war was discussed internally. Although not yet applied on a large scale, it was already considered part of the economic model of expansion. The German economy was built upon a race against time. Military spending became unsustainable unless accompanied by conquests that would finance it through territorial and industrial plunder. Hitler and his economic advisors believed that Germany had to begin expansion at the moment its military strength reached its peak, before the weight of indebtedness and lack of access to external resources weakened its position. Rearmament was not designed to sustain a prolonged war of attrition. It was oriented toward a brief and decisive war that would secure the resources necessary to continue expansion. Confidence in the inevitability of conflict led the economy to adopt a logic of permanent risk. The country functioned as if it were already on campaign. Productive decisions responded to military rather than civilian needs. Time was considered a strategic factor. Germany had to strike before other powers, especially France and Great Britain, completed their own rearmament. By the end of 1938, the German economy was fully oriented toward the war effort. Every factory, every worker, and every ton of steel formed part of a system that no longer produced for peace. The Third Reich was not preparing to respond to aggression, but to unleash a war it considered inevitable and necessary. The economy had been transformed into a machine whose sole purpose was to provide the Wehrmacht with the means to advance. What until then had been an internal construction was beginning to demand external expansion to keep itself running. Society as a civilian army. While the economy was reorganized to sustain a future war effort and the Wehrmacht expanded as a modern force, the regime understood that a total war could not be sustained only with weapons. It was necessary to transform the entire population into a disciplined body, ideologically cohesive and willing to assume sacrifice. Germany ceased to be a group of individual citizens to become a combat community in formation. Propaganda began to present the people as an organic unit whose mission was to support the Führer in fulfilling national destiny. Obedience was no longer only a legal duty, but a vital function of the collective body. Education was the first field of social militarization. Schools were restructured to instill discipline, physical strength, and loyalty. Academic content was subordinated to ideological principles that exalted war as a natural act of racial superiority. History was taught as a succession of battles in which Germany had been betrayed or halted by internal and external enemies. Biology became an instrument to legitimize the idea that only the strong had the right to prevail. The teacher ceased to be a neutral educator and became an agent of national indoctrination. The next step was the control of youth. The Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, which became mandatory in 1936, was a system of ideological and physical training that turned adolescents into future soldiers. Indoctrination began at 10 years old, instilling obedience to the Führer, contempt for weakness and willingness to act on behalf of the Reich. The activities included marches, endurance exercises, pre-military instruction, and collective discipline practices. They were taught to act in groups, to obey orders without questioning them, and to consider total surrender to the state as supreme virtue. For children, belonging to the Hitlerjugend was not a political option, but the obligatory path of social integration. At the same time, the state created the Reichsarbeitsdienst, Reich labor service, mandatory for young men before joining the army. This service consisted of rural work, road and infrastructure construction under strict paramilitary discipline. Its main function was not economic productivity, but to psychologically train young men for obedience, communal life under command, and the acceptance of prolonged physical effort as patriotic duty. It was the stage prior to the military uniform, designed so that the transition to the Wehrmacht would not imply a cultural change, but the continuation of an already internalized process. Women were not trained for combat, but they were also incorporated into the logic of war. The Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, promoted the idea of motherhood as a national function. The figure of the woman was exalted as generator of future soldiers and moral support of the warrior. Physical health, racial purity, and dedication to the ideal of the Reich became criteria of female value. The social role of women was militarized indirectly. They were not to fight, but to nourish biologically and psychologically the army of the future. Propaganda was the glue that held together this society trained for obedience. Cinema, radio, and the press repeated messages that glorified strength, sacrifice, and the idea that Germany's destiny lay in the hands of those willing to fight. The figure of the soldier appeared not as a professional, but as the highest ideal of the citizen. Military parades were not limited to displaying strength, but to emotionally instructing the population in the aesthetics of power. Seeing formations marching in unison reminded every spectator that collective discipline was the social norm. Everyday language was also absorbed by military logic. Terms such as mobilization, home front, enemies of the people, or national duty became common. Civil life was interpreted as constant preparation for an imminent conflict. The idea was promoted that every work, educational, or community activity formed part of a war not yet declared. Working in a factory, studying in a school, or raising children was presented as a direct contribution to the future military triumph. Independent associations were eliminated or absorbed. There were no neutral spaces where the population could escape regime control. Private life was reduced. Conversations could be reported. Behaviors considered weak or disloyal were singled out. Social pressure pushed millions to act like soldiers, even outside uniforms. Fear of being excluded from the national community reinforced submission. Individual identity was subsumed under the collective identity articulated around the Führer. The concept of Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, functioned as the ideological basis for this process. According to this vision, all Germans were members of a unitary national organism. There were no social classes, but a shared mission. Internal struggle was forbidden. Only confrontation against external or internal enemies defined by the state was permitted. Cohesion did not arise from participation, but from discipline. The ideal citizen was one who devoted himself completely to duty without demanding explanations. This system generated an emotional climate where war was internalized as a legitimate and necessary form of national expression. Death ceased to be perceived as individual tragedy and came to be contemplated as a possible honorable destiny. The idea of sacrifice was normalized as a prerequisite for the rebirth of the homeland. Heroism was directly linked to willingness to die when the Führer ordered it. By the end of 1938, German society no longer thought as a population in peace. The younger generations had grown up under combat-oriented education. Adults had been incorporated into collective structures of national discipline. Women had been defined as reproducers of soldiers. Workers saw themselves as part of the productive effort of the home front. The elderly were moral guardians of patriotic duty. Germany had become a barracks without declared war, where each individual occupied a tactical role within a state design. This level of cohesion did not mean absence of internal tensions, but they remained hidden under the pressure of collective duty. Society had been shaped not to debate, but to execute. Obedience had become a condition of belonging. The population was prepared not only to accept war, but to see it as a necessary step. The state had managed to transform millions of individuals into a military reserve, aware that the next move would not be internal, but external. Rehearsals of aggression, Austria, the Sudetenland, and announced Czechoslovakia. The internal transformation of Germany into a militarized state required a testing phase before unleashing total war. The regime needed to verify the population's willingness to support expansionist actions, test the Wehrmacht's ability for rapid mobilization, gauge the reaction of Western powers, and secure essential strategic resources. The expansions prior to 1939 were not diplomatic improvisations, but practical exercises in controlled aggression that strengthened the confidence of the military apparatus and validated the idea that Germany could advance without facing significant resistance. The first objective was Austria. Since 1933, Hitler had viewed the union of Austria with the Reich as a natural step toward building a greater Germany. The Anschluss was conceived not merely as a political movement, but as a human and territorial absorption to reinforce the Reich's demographic and military power. Austria had about 6.5 million inhabitants and an army that could be integrated into the Wehrmacht. Moreover, its annexation provided a strategically crucial position toward the south and east. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border without encountering resistance. The Wehrmacht marched among crowds cheering the Union, reinforcing the internal sense of a fulfilled historical mission. The occupation was immediate and total. The Austrian army was incorporated, its officers evaluated and selectively integrated. Thousands of Austrian recruits were absorbed as future soldiers of the Reich. The annexation demonstrated that Germany could act militarily without firing a shot, and that the idea of national unity could justify an occupation. Hitler received massive support within Germany. The success created the sense that his leadership was infallible and that expansionism had a favorable destiny. The next step was Czechoslovakia, focusing particularly on the Sudetenland, a region with approximately 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler used the rhetoric of national self-determination to claim the territory. The Sudeten German minority was portrayed as an oppressed population that needed to be rescued by the Reich. This discourse justified diplomatic pressure accompanied by military threats. The Wehrmacht prepared for a possible invasion, while the Luftwaffe carried out air demonstrations that sent a clear message of power. The result was the Munich Agreement, signed on September 30, 1938 by Germany, Italy, France, and the United Kingdom. The Western powers agreed to cede the Sudetenland to Germany under the pretext of preserving peace. Czechoslovakia was not consulted. The Wehrmacht entered the Sudetenland without confrontation. This event had decisive consequences. It confirmed that France and Great Britain were unwilling to go to war for a Central European country. It demonstrated that military blackmail worked without combat. It allowed Germany to present itself internally as a supreme diplomatic power backed by real force. After success in the Sudetenland, Hitler no longer considered any further negotiation necessary. On March 15, 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This time, the principle of self-determination was not invoked. A total occupation was carried out. Bohemia and Moravia became a German protectorate, while Slovakia was turned into a satellite state. This annexation represented an open break with the Munich agreements and a demonstration that the Reich no longer felt the need to justify its expansionism with diplomatic reasoning. The strategic importance of Czechoslovakia was immense. The Skoda armament industry, one of the most important in Europe, fell under German control. The Wehrmacht gained access to weapons, vehicles, and industrial resources that would be used in later campaigns. Furthermore, Czech territory provided an excellent base for future operations in Poland and Eastern Europe. The occupation of Czechoslovakia allowed Germany to test its logistical capacity to maintain occupation forces and control foreign resources without significant armed resistance. Each step reinforced the conviction that German military power could be imposed without triggering an immediate hostile coalition. The passivity of France and Great Britain strengthened the belief that their threats lacked substance. German society accepted these conquests as inevitable national achievements, celebrated as proofs of strength and historical justice. The Wehrmacht, which had not faced a real war since 1918, gained confidence in its structure, mobility, and deployment capacity. The occupation exercises functioned as rehearsals for broader expansion. Territorial annexation also consolidated the idea that German foreign policy was guided by a logic of calculated pressure. Act quickly, display strength, provoke the enemy's indecision, and occupy before a hostile decision could be made. This became the tactical foundation of the regime's strategic thought to strike before the adversary had time to react. Success in Austria and Czechoslovakia gave credibility to the strategy of calculated risk. Internally, high military command began to adapt its plans to a policy of constant offense. The population had internalized expansion as a legitimate destiny. The public administration adjusted to govern foreign territories. The SS began operating as a force of racial and political control in the occupied regions. The Wehrmacht confirmed its ability to occupy, displace, and annex without facing organized resistance. The entire state apparatus was being trained in the administration of conquered territories. By occupying Czechoslovakia without armed opposition, Germany crossed a line. It had demonstrated that it was willing to occupy sovereign European states, even without ethnic arguments. At that point, the Reich no longer acted as a revisionist power, but as an unlimited expansionist force. The next phase could no longer be limited to annexations without war. It required confronting powers that now understood that their passivity only strengthened the enemy. On March 31, 1939, Great Britain publicly guaranteed the independence of Poland. That declaration marked the beginning of a new stage. Germany knew that the next campaign would probably trigger an open war with the Western powers. But the regime believed that the Wehrmacht was ready and that the enemy was not. The machine is ready, packed with Stalin and final order of attack. By mid-1939, Germany had reached a point of no return. The reconstruction of military power had advanced to the maximum without firing a single shot against a major power. The Wehrmacht had been expanded, trained, and equipped under the assumption that it would be ready for total action in a short time. The economy was entirely oriented toward the war effort, and its sustainability depended on territorial expansion that would provide resources and industrial spoils. Society had been shaped to obey, sacrifice itself, and accept war as an inevitable act. The time spent in preparation had to become action to avoid the exhaustion of the system. After the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Hitler made clear to his inner circle that Poland would be the next target. The Danzig corridor was used as a geopolitical argument, but the real objective was greater: to open the Eastern Front, obtain access to agricultural and strategic resources, and establish a central position from which to continue expansion. The conquest of Poland was not seen as an end, but as the operational beginning of a longer war aimed at breaking the European balance. However, there was a fundamental risk: the possibility of a two-front war. France and Britain had guaranteed Poland's independence. Although the regime believed that these powers acted weakly, it could not risk extending its force eastward while the threat in the west remained open. It was necessary to find a temporary strategic solution. German foreign policy, while maintaining superficial contacts with the British and French, secretly advanced toward an agreement with the Soviet Union, the ideological enemy declared by National Socialism. Negotiations with Moscow advanced rapidly. Stalin understood that a war between the Western powers and Germany would offer him strategic advantages, and he was willing to cooperate temporarily to gain time. On August 23, 1939, the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the USSR was signed, known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. A secret protocol accompanied the treaty. Both powers agreed to divide Poland and distribute spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The Soviets would obtain freedom of action in Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. Germany would have control of the western sector of Poland. With the eastern flank neutralized, Hitler considered that he had secured the space needed to wage a rapid war in Poland without fear of a simultaneous attack from the east. Diplomacy had been used as an extension of military strategy. The pact with Stalin did not imply an ideological alliance, but a tactical agreement to facilitate the German offensive and complicate the reaction of the Allies. In the days following the signing of the pact, military preparations intensified. The Wehrmacht mobilized troops to the Polish border. The panzer divisions were positioned to enter enemy territory quickly and break defensive lines before the Polish army could reorganize. The Luftwaffe prepared for an air offensive aimed at destroying communications and command centers. The goal was to demonstrate that blitzkrieg was not only a theoretical doctrine, but a tool already ready for execution. Victory had to be quick to prevent France and Britain from intervening effectively. Internally, propaganda intensified the narrative of Polish aggression as justification for an armed response. Claims of mistreatment of German minorities and border provocations were spread. The discourse did not seek to build rational consensus, but to trigger automatic obedience already installed in a society accustomed to accepting war as destiny. Enthusiasm was not required, only discipline. The German military command understood that victory in Poland would be the first real test of the newly built machine. Since 1935, the Wehrmacht had been trained for rapid offensive war. The Luftwaffe expected to demonstrate its tactical superiority with coordinated attacks from the first day. The logistical apparatus had been planned to sustain operations dependent on speed, not prolonged attrition. Hitler trusted that a lightning victory would demoralize the Western Allies and possibly prevent a prolonged conflict on the Western Front. The final instructions to the commanders made clear that this was not a limited campaign, but the beginning of a continuous escalation. The conquest of Poland was to serve as a base for future deployments. War was conceived as a sequence of successive actions where each victory would open the door to a next operation. The entire structure of the Third Reich depended on this chain not stopping. On August 25, 1939, when everything was ready to begin the offensive, Hitler decided to briefly postpone the final order due to the signing of the Mutual Assistance Treaty between Britain and Poland. He did not abandon the objective. He only adjusted the maneuver to confirm that the strategic impulse remained viable. The machine was tense, but awaited the definitive signal. During the last days of August, military reports confirmed that the troops were ready and morale was high. Civil authorities implemented measures for total control of information and prepared mechanisms of internal mobilization. Weapons, industries, and mines were aligned. The offensive against Poland was not presented as a war against an isolated enemy, but as the beginning of a series of victories that would redefine the European map. The logic of the regime did not admit setbacks. Germany had become a war machine prepared to expand. Diplomacy had already fulfilled its objective. The economy was already oriented toward conflict. Society accepted sacrifice. The army awaited its first great test. Hitler gave the final order. On September 1, 1939, at dawn, the Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border. The Third Reich had entered into war.